Emotional immaturity is a pattern of behavior where an individual struggles to manage their emotions, lacks self-awareness, and often reacts impulsively. In the context of parenting, this immaturity can manifest in ways that profoundly impact a child's emotional development. Parents who are emotionally immature may not possess the tools to process their feelings healthily, leading to inconsistent reactions and unpredictable behavior that leaves their children confused and anxious. It is not always a matter of intent. Sometimes these parents were never taught how to regulate their emotions, or were raised in environments where emotional growth was stunted. One of the most telling signs of emotional immaturity is a parent's inability to separate their own emotions from those of their child. They may project their unresolved feelings onto the child, making them feel responsible for the parent's happiness or misery. This creates a dynamic where the child becomes overly concerned with maintaining the parent's emotional equilibrium rather than developing their own sense of self. In such environments, the child is forced to mature quickly, often adopting a caretaker role, learning to read moods, and walking on eggshells. Emotional immaturity also reveals itself through a lack of empathy. These parents may struggle to genuinely understand or acknowledge their child's emotions. When a child expresses sadness, fear, or even joy, an emotionally immature parent might dismiss these feelings, label them as overreactions, or respond with anger or frustration. The child learns that their emotions are inconvenient, unimportant, or even wrong. Over time, this erodes the child's confidence in their emotional experiences, leaving them disconnected from their own feelings. Another common trait is a tendency toward blame and deflection. Rather than owning up to mistakes, emotionally immature parents often shift responsibility to others, sometimes even to their children. If a disagreement occurs, the child might be accused of being disrespectful or ungrateful, even if they were simply expressing their feelings. These parents view any form of disagreement as a threat rather than an opportunity for understanding, and as a result, their children grow up feeling guilty for having their own opinions. Emotional volatility is another hallmark of immature parents. Their moods can change without warning, leaving the household atmosphere tense and unpredictable. Children quickly learn to gauge their parents' emotional state the moment they walk in the door. Laughter can turn to anger in an instant, and joy can dissolve into tears without explanation. This inconsistency breeds insecurity in children who may struggle to develop a stable sense of safety and trust. Rigid expectations are also common. Emotionally immature parents may impose their dreams and desires onto their children, demanding perfection or unwavering obedience. Rather than being nurtured as a unique individual, the child is pressured to conform, suppressing their true self to earn love and approval. Denial is another coping mechanism frequently employed by emotionally immature parents. They may outright refuse to acknowledge their own hurtful behavior, rewriting history to suit their narrative. Even when confronted with clear examples of their actions, they may deny or minimize the impact. This gaslighting can leave the child doubting their own perceptions and memories, creating a painful sense of self-doubt that lingers into adulthood. Lastly, emotionally immature parents often struggle with vulnerability. They avoid difficult conversations, refuse to apologize, and fear being seen as flawed. This fear of vulnerability leads to a surface-level relationship with their children where honest communication is rare and emotional intimacy is nearly impossible. The child learns to suppress their own vulnerability as well, adopting a guarded approach to relationships even outside the home. Lack of empathy in emotionally immature parents is a silent wound that leaves deep scars. These parents struggle to step outside of their own feelings and view the world through their child's eyes. When their child is upset, hurt, or overwhelmed, instead of offering comfort, they may dismiss these feelings as trivial or overdramatic. A child crying after a tough day at school might be met with irritation instead of a comforting embrace. The underlying message is clear. Your feelings are an inconvenience. Over time, the child learns that their emotions are not safe to share. This lack of empathy often leads to a communication breakdown. When a child tries to express their struggles, whether it's anxiety over making friends or the hurt of being left out, Emotionally immature parents might interrupt with their own stories, turn the conversation toward their own problems, or even accuse the child of being too sensitive. In these moments, the child feels unheard and misunderstood, leaving them isolated even in the presence of their parent. The natural urge to seek comfort from a parent is replaced with hesitation as they brace themselves for criticism or dismissal. Emotionally immature parents may also engage in comparative suffering. If a child expresses sadness or disappointment, the parent might respond with statements like, "You think you have it hard when I was your age," or "You don't know what real problems are." Instead of validating the child's emotions, they diminish them, making the child feel guilty for experiencing perfectly normal feelings. A child learns to internalize pain, convinced that their struggles are insignificant, even when they are genuinely overwhelming. This lack of empathy can create a painful cycle of emotional suppression. Children who are repeatedly dismissed or judged for their feelings begin to hide their emotions, fearing rejection. They develop a habit of masking their true selves, becoming overly agreeable or distant just to maintain peace. This emotional suppression can follow them into adulthood, where they struggle to identify or communicate their feelings in relationships. The echo of being misunderstood in childhood haunts them, making vulnerability feel like a dangerous gamble. Even in moments of visible distress, an emotionally immature parent may turn this situation around to focus on their own discomfort. If a child is crying, the parent might say, "Stop crying, you're making me upset," or "You're so dramatic, I can't deal with this right now." The child is left feeling not only unheard, but also burdened with the responsibility of managing the parent's emotional state. This reversal of roles forces the child into an unhealthy dynamic where they become the emotional caretaker rather than the one being cared for. Lack of empathy doesn't always manifest as harshness. Sometimes it appears as indifference. When a child is struggling, an emotionally immature parent may respond with a shrug, change the subject, or simply leave the room. This emotional neglect is just as damaging as overt criticism. It sends the silent message that the child's feelings are unimportant, that they are alone even when surrounded by family. This emotional void leaves the child yearning for connection, often seeking validation and understanding elsewhere. The consequences of growing up with parents who lack empathy are profound. These children may become hyper-aware of others' emotions, developing a people-pleasing mindset as they try to earn the validation they never received. Or they may swing to the other extreme, shutting down emotionally and struggling to form close connections. Trust becomes a fragile concept because they were never taught the safety of being understood. Even as adults, they may continue to question the validity of their feelings, forever seeking the acceptance they were denied. A lack of empathy from parents doesn't just affect how children view themselves. It shapes their perception of relationships. They may come to believe that love is conditional, that they must perform a role or suppress their needs to be worthy of care. This early lesson echoes into adulthood, influencing their friendships, romantic relationships, and even their relationship with themselves. The silent question lingers: is it okay for me to feel what I feel? Emotional outbursts are a common trait of emotionally immature parents, creating a home environment filled with tension and unpredictability. These outbursts can range from sudden anger over minor inconveniences to intense sadness or anxiety that seems to come out of nowhere. For a child, this instability feels like living in a constant state of alert. They become experts at reading their parents' facial expressions, listening for shifts in tone, and even adjusting their own behavior to prevent triggering a reaction. Childhood, which should be a time of exploration and self-discovery, becomes a delicate dance of managing someone else's emotions. Such parents often lack the skills to regulate their emotions, so when they experience frustration, disappointment, or fear, they express it without restraint. A spilled drink at the dinner table might lead to a furious outburst, complete with yelling and accusations. A slight inconvenience, such as a misplaced item, might trigger a wave of blame directed at everyone in the household. In these moments, The child learns to view minor mistakes as catastrophic, developing an overwhelming fear of making even the smallest error. But the chaos of emotional outbursts isn't just about anger. Sometimes it is about emotional fragility. An emotionally immature parent may suddenly burst into tears, overwhelmed by their own struggles, and expect their child to provide comfort. They may share inappropriate details about their adult problems, such as financial struggles, conflicts with a spouse, or their own childhood traumas. In doing so, they inadvertently cast the child in the role of emotional caretaker, forcing them to become a confidant long before they are emotionally equipped for it. Over time, the child develops a heightened sense of responsibility for their parents' emotional state. They learn to tiptoe around the house, avoid certain topics, and even take on household tasks beyond their years just to maintain a fragile peace. They may try to cheer the parent up when they sense a bad mood coming, acting as a therapist or peacekeeper rather than a child. This misplaced responsibility robs them of the safety and freedom that a healthy childhood should provide, leaving them emotionally drained and confused. Another consequence of living with an emotionally volatile parent is a constant fear of rejection. Since outbursts can occur without warning, the child becomes hyper-aware of their own behavior, trying to be good enough to avoid triggering an episode. Praise may be showered on them one moment, only to be replaced with harsh criticism the next. This roller coaster of affection and anger creates a deep sense of insecurity, leading the child to doubt their worth. Even when they achieve something notable, they may find it difficult to feel proud, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. The unpredictability of emotional outbursts also means that conflict becomes something to fear rather than an opportunity for resolution. Children in such environments rarely learn how to communicate their own frustrations or disagreements in a healthy way. Instead, they become conflict avoidant, hiding their true feelings to maintain peace. Or they may internalize the chaotic energy, becoming easily overwhelmed by their own emotions because they were never taught how to process them calmly. Emotional outbursts can even turn the parent-child relationship into a form of emotional hostage-taking. The parent may use their distress as a weapon, making statements like, "After all I do for you, this is how you treat me?" Or, "If you cared about me, you wouldn't upset me." The child learns that their own needs and emotions are secondary to the parents'. They become conditioned to put their parents' feelings above their own, a pattern that can continue well into adulthood, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation in future relationships. Perhaps most damaging of all, these unpredictable emotional outbursts create an environment where love feels conditional. A child raised in this setting never knows when they will receive affection and when they will be the target of anger. This inconsistency teaches them that love is something that must be earned through careful behavior rather than something that is freely given. Even as adults, they may struggle to believe that they are worthy of love without constantly proving themselves or sacrificing their own needs. Conditional love is a painful reality for many children raised by emotionally immature parents. In these households, affection, praise, and acceptance are not given freely, but are instead linked to specific achievements or behaviors. A child may feel a rush of approval when they bring home good grades, excel in sports, or perform tasks that make the parent look good to others. But when they falter, make mistakes, or express emotions that the parent finds inconvenient, the warmth vanishes. Love becomes a currency, something to be earned, rather than an unwavering foundation. This dynamic creates a relentless pressure to perform. The child learns that their worth is tied to their ability to meet the parent's expectations, leading to a constant sense of anxiety. Even moments of success become tainted because they are not celebrated for the child's happiness or growth, but rather for the parent's pride. A child who brings home an award may hear, "I'm proud of you," only if it can be shown off to family and friends. Failure, on the other hand, is met with disappointment, criticism, or even withdrawal of affection. In households ruled by conditional love, individuality is often sacrificed. The child is subtly or overtly encouraged to pursue activities, hobbies, or even friendships that align with the parent's desires rather than their own interests. A child passionate about art may be pushed toward a more prestigious career path because it reflects better on the family. Expressions of creativity or personal preferences that deviate from the parent's vision are dismissed or ridiculed. The child learns to suppress their true self to maintain the parent's approval. This conditional approval also extends to emotional expression. Children in such environments may quickly learn that only positive emotions are allowed. Happiness, politeness, and obedience are rewarded, while sadness, anger, or vulnerability are met with irritation or punishment. A child who cries may be told to stop being dramatic, while one who expresses frustration may be labeled disrespectful. The message is clear: only certain emotions are acceptable, and others must be hidden. Over time, the child becomes disconnected from their own emotional landscape. A tragic consequence of conditional love is the internalization of shame. Because the child is only valued for what they do rather than who they are, they begin to see themselves as fundamentally flawed whenever they fall short of expectations. A poor grade or a mistake is not just a learning opportunity, it is a sign of personal failure. This deep sense of inadequacy can follow them into adulthood, where they become perfectionists, constantly striving to earn approval in relationships, at work, and even in their own self-image. This dynamic also fosters an unhealthy fear of rejection. Because love is never guaranteed, the child becomes hypervigilant, always analyzing their parent's mood, anticipating their expectations, and adjusting their behavior to avoid displeasure. This people-pleasing mindset often extends beyond the family, making the child susceptible to manipulation in friendships and romantic relationships. The desperate need for approval becomes a quiet, ever-present burden. Another damaging aspect of conditional love is that it teaches children that love is transactional. They learn to view relationships as exchanges, where affection must be earned through compliance, achievement, or self-sacrifice. This belief can make it difficult for them to accept unconditional love as adults. This dynamic also fosters an unhealthy fear of rejection. Because love is never guaranteed, the child becomes hypervigilant, always analyzing their parent's mood, anticipating their expectations, and adjusting their behavior to avoid displeasure. This people-pleasing mindset often extends beyond the family, making the child susceptible to manipulation in friendships and romantic relationships. The desperate need for approval becomes a quiet, ever-present burden. Another damaging aspect of conditional love is that it teaches children that love is transactional. They learn to view relationships as exchanges, where affection must be earned through compliance, achievement, or self-sacrifice. This belief can make it difficult for them to accept unconditional love as adults. If they yell at their child unjustly, they might later claim it never happened, or insist the child was at fault for making them angry. Admitting wrongdoing feels like a threat to their fragile sense of self, so they rewrite reality, creating a version of events where they are always justified. This constant distortion of the truth leaves the child feeling confused and doubting their own perceptions. One of the most common tactics used by emotionally immature parents in denial is blame shifting. When confronted with their hurtful behavior, they may immediately redirect the focus to their child's supposed flaws. "I wouldn't have yelled if you weren't so disrespectful," or "maybe if you did what I asked the first time, I wouldn't lose my temper." In this twisted logic, the child becomes responsible for the parent's reaction. Over time, the child learns to accept blame for things beyond their control, internalizing a sense of guilt even when they have done nothing wrong. Another form of denial appears in the refusal to acknowledge the impact of their actions. Even when a child bravely tries to express how they were hurt, an emotionally immature parent might dismiss their feelings with phrases like, "You're too sensitive," or "That was just a joke, you need to lighten up." In doing so, they minimize the child's emotional experience, making them question the validity of their own feelings. The child learns to suppress their pain, believing that they are overreacting or being unreasonable. Denial can also manifest as a complete refusal to discuss difficult topics. If a child tries to bring up a past incident where they felt mistreated, the parent may shut down the conversation with, "I don't want to hear it," or That's in the past. Stop dwelling on it. This avoidance leaves unresolved wounds that continue to affect the child, who is left without closure or validation. The child's emotional world is treated as a nuisance rather than a reality that deserves attention. Emotionally immature parents may even rewrite family history to avoid responsibility. They may claim that they were always supportive, even if they were critical or dismissive. They might insist they were only trying to help when they were actually controlled. This gaslighting can be deeply confusing for the child, who begins to question their own memories. The sense of reality becomes distorted, and they may struggle with self-trust because their experiences are consistently invalidated. Defensiveness is another layer of this dynamic. When their behavior is questioned, "I'm just a terrible parent, aren't I?" they might declare, turning the conversation away from accountability and toward their own need for reassurance. The child, hoping to maintain peace, often ends up comforting the parent, apologizing for having spoken up, and abandoning their own hurt. This emotional manipulation turns the child into a caretaker rather than the one being cared for. In some cases, the denial is so extreme that emotionally immature parents convince themselves of their own false narratives. They may genuinely believe they were perfect parents, always supportive and understanding, even when their actions told a different story. This self-deception is a form of emotional armor, protecting them from the discomfort of self-reflection. Unfortunately, it also means that the child's pain is rendered invisible, treated as a distortion rather than a valid experience. Perhaps most painfully, denial and defensiveness make true emotional connection impossible. The child can never fully express themselves because they are met with denial instead of understanding. They learn to hide their feelings, avoid difficult conversations, and walk on eggshells to maintain a fragile peace. In this environment, honesty is dangerous and vulnerability is a risk. The child becomes emotionally isolated, longing for a connection that always seems just out of reach. The impact of emotionally immature parenting on a child is profound and far-reaching, affecting their self-esteem, boundaries, and emotional health in ways that often persist into adulthood. At the core, these children grow up feeling that love is something they must earn. When affection is conditional or inconsistent, they internalize the belief that they are only valuable when they are pleasing others or meeting expectations. This can manifest as a relentless inner critic, a voice that constantly questions their worth, even in the face of achievements or praise. Self-esteem becomes fragile because the child's sense of identity is built around external validation rather than an intrinsic understanding of their own worth. A kind word can make them feel elated, while a slight criticism can send them spiraling into self-doubt. They may become perfectionists, desperately striving for flawless performance in school, relationships, or work, not out of a genuine desire to succeed, but out of fear of disappointing others. Every mistake feels catastrophic because it seems to threaten their value as a person. The confusion created by denial and defensiveness from parents teaches the child to doubt their own perceptions. When their feelings are consistently dismissed or invalidated, they learn to question their emotional experiences. They may struggle to identify what they truly feel, often second-guessing their own emotions or apologizing for expressing them. This emotional uncertainty can lead them vulnerable to manipulation as they look to others for validation of their reality. Boundaries are another area deeply affected. Children of emotionally immature parents are often taught, directly or indirectly, that their needs are secondary. They become accustomed to putting others first, suppressing their own desires, and even enduring mistreatment to maintain harmony. This lack of healthy boundaries carries over into adulthood, where they may find it difficult to say no, establish personal space, or protect themselves from toxic relationships. They become people pleasers, afraid of conflict and desperate for approval. Emotionally, these children grow up in a state of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring the moods of others and adjusting their behavior to avoid triggering negative reactions. This emotional hypersensitivity can be exhausting, leading to anxiety or even panic attacks. They may struggle to relax, always anticipating the next emotional storm. Their nervous system is trained to stay on high alert, which can have long-term effects on their mental and physical health. Trust is another casualty. Because emotionally immature parents are unpredictable, one moment affectionate, the next critical, the child learns that relationships are unstable. Even in adulthood, they may struggle to believe that others will genuinely care for them without an ulterior motive. They may become overly guarded, fearing betrayal, or they may become overly dependent, desperate for reassurance. Relationships feel like a constant test, where they must prove their worth to avoid being abandoned. The child's ability to express their own emotions also becomes stunted. After years of being told that their feelings are wrong, exaggerated, or a burden, they learn to hide their true emotional state. They may become emotionally numb, unable to connect with their own feelings. Or they may overexpress emotions in an attempt to be understood. Anger may feel terrifying because they associate it with chaos, while sadness feels shameful because it was always dismissed. They are left struggling to understand what is appropriate or safe to feel. Perhaps most tragically, these children often develop a distorted sense of love because they were conditioned to believe that love must be earned or maintained through sacrifice. They may find themselves drawn to unhealthy relationships where they are taken for granted or mistreated. They may mistake intensity for affection, believing that emotional highs and lows are a sign of passion. Their early experiences have taught them that love is unpredictable, and so they gravitate toward the familiar, even when it is painful. Healing from the wounds of emotionally immature parenting begins with recognition. It is a courageous act to look back at one's childhood with honest eyes, to acknowledge the pain, confusion, and unmet needs that were present. For many, this process is difficult because denial is a natural defense mechanism, a way to protect the mind from painful truths. But healing requires breaking through this denial, understanding that the difficulties they faced were not a result of personal failure, but of an environment where emotional maturity was lacking. Recognizing the trauma means giving oneself permission to see it clearly, without minimizing or justifying it. Self-compassion becomes an essential tool in the healing journey. For those who grew up feeling that their worth was tied to perfection, learning to offer themselves kindness can feel uncomfortable at first. But self-compassion is about understanding that it is okay to have flaws, to make mistakes, and to have emotions. It is about speaking to oneself with the same gentleness they might offer to a friend who is suffering. When self-criticism rises, self-compassion responds with reassurance. You are doing your best, or it is okay to feel hurt. Over time, this practice helps rebuild self-esteem that was damaged by conditional love. Understanding and naming the patterns of emotional immaturity experienced in childhood can also be a powerful step toward healing. Learning about emotional immaturity, gaslighting, blame shifting, and denial allows survivors to see that their struggles were not imagined. Books, therapy, support groups, or even reflective journaling can provide the language needed to identify and understand the unhealthy dynamics they experienced. This awareness is like turning on a light in a dark room. It brings clarity and validation, making it easier to separate their own identity from the distortions they were taught. One of the most transformative aspects of healing is learning to set and maintain healthy emotional boundaries. This can be a daunting task for someone who grew up believing that their needs were secondary, or who was punished for expressing their feelings. But boundaries are not about rejecting others. They are about honoring oneself. They might begin with small steps, like saying no to requests that feel overwhelming, taking time to process emotions without guilt, or refusing to take responsibility for someone else's feelings. Boundaries are a declaration of self-worth. Reclaiming emotional authenticity is another critical part of healing. This means allowing oneself to feel a full range of emotions without shame, anger, sadness, joy, fear, and everything in between. For those who were taught to suppress their feelings, this may feel frightening at first, but reconnecting with emotions is about rediscovering a part of oneself that was buried. It may involve exploring creative outlets, practicing mindfulness, or simply taking a few minutes each day to check in and ask, what am I feeling right now? Emotional honesty is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of courage. Building a support network is also crucial. For someone who has always felt they had to navigate their emotions alone, reaching out for support can be transformative. This support can come from trusted friends, empathetic family members, a therapist, or support groups with others who have experienced similar struggles. Being surrounded by people who genuinely listen, validate, and encourage can help replace the loneliness of childhood with a sense of belonging and safety. Another powerful step in healing is letting go of the need for parental validation. This does not mean rejecting parents or denying any love that may exist between them. Instead, it means accepting that the approval they may have once craved is not necessary for their happiness or self-worth. It is about understanding that emotionally immature parents may never be able to provide the understanding or apology they desire. Rather than waiting for healing to come from the outside, they learn to give themselves the love and validation they always deserved. Finally, healing involves rewriting the narrative of their life. Rather than seeing themselves solely as a victim of difficult circumstances, they begin to recognize their own resilience, strength, and capacity for growth. The struggles they endure do not define them. Their ability to rise above them does. This narrative shift allows them to see that they are not simply the product of their past, but the author of their own future. They are free to create relationships that are healthy, choose paths that bring joy, and become the loving, compassionate person they always needed. Reclaiming your narrative begins with understanding that your story is yours to tell, not just a collection of the painful experiences imposed upon you. For those who grew up with emotionally immature parents, it is easy to feel trapped in a role assigned by others, whether it was the caretaker, the troublemaker, the perfect child, or the invisible one. These roles may have once helped you survive, but they are not who you truly are. Reclaiming your narrative means stepping out of these limiting labels and exploring the full spectrum of your identity. One of the most powerful ways to reclaim your narrative is through self-reflection. This can mean journaling, speaking with a trusted friend or therapist, or simply taking quiet moments to reflect on your life without judgment. Rather than focusing solely on the pain, you begin to see the strength you showed in difficult moments, the resilience of enduring, the empathy you developed from understanding complex emotions, the courage it took to keep going. You are not just a survivor of your past. You are someone who learned, adapted, and grew despite it. Recognizing the false beliefs you inherited from childhood is another crucial step. Emotionally immature parents often project their insecurities onto their children, leaving them with harmful narratives such as, "I am not good enough," "I am too sensitive," or "I must be perfect to be loved." But these are not truths. They are distortions born from another person's limitation. Reclaiming your narrative means challenging these beliefs, recognizing them as someone else's fears that you do not have to carry. You are free to write a new story about who you are. This process also involves embracing your authentic self. For years, you may have hidden parts of yourself to earn approval or avoid conflict. But reclaiming your narrative means giving yourself permission to rediscover your passions, preferences, and values without fear of judgment. You may reconnect with a love for art that was dismissed, rediscover your voice after years of being silenced, or allow yourself to feel emotions that were once forbidden. Authenticity is not something you need to earn, it is your birthright. Another powerful aspect of reclaiming your narrative is choosing how you tell your own story. Rather than seeing yourself only through the lens of trauma, you begin to frame your experiences as a journey of transformation. The pain you endured becomes a source of empathy for others. The struggles you faced become evidence of your strength. The mistakes you made become lessons rather than proof of failure. This shift in perspective transforms you from a passive character in your story to the hero of your own life. Forgiveness, not necessarily for your parents, but for yourself, is also part of this journey. You may need to forgive yourself for the ways you coped when you didn't know any better, for staying silent to maintain peace, for for craving approval that was never given, or for losing yourself while trying to please others. This self-forgiveness is not about excusing the harm you endured. It is about releasing the shame you have carried for simply trying to survive. Reclaiming your narrative also means choosing the relationships you want in your life. You are no longer obligated to maintain connections that drain you or make you question your worth. Healthy relationships become a priority. Those where you are respected, understood, and valued for who you are. You learn to set boundaries not as a form of rejection, but as a declaration of self-respect. Love becomes something you experience freely rather than something you must earn. Finally, reclaiming your narrative means understanding that healing is an ongoing journey, not a destination. There will be days when old doubts resurface, and that is okay. But now you have the tools to face them. You understand your worth. You know how to care for yourself, and you have the power to choose how your story continues. You are not just a product of your past. You are the author of your future.